It was the year 536 AD, and something happened that people would never forget. The sun began to disappear, not completely, but enough to terrify an entire world. Ancient writers described a strange sky, a sun that looked weak, a light that seemed more like the moon. Nobody understood what was happening. Nobody knew why. And nobody knew that this was only the beginning. For months, the sky remained dark. Then months became years. Temperatures dropped. Summer became cold. Crops began to fail. Harvest disappeared. And across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, people started to starve. Entire communities faced hunger. Trade slowed. Kingdoms weakened. And fear spread faster than answers. Some believed the gods were angry. Others thought the end of the world had arrived. But the truth was far worse. Because this strange darkness was only the first disaster. And within a few years, humanity would face something even deadlier. Something that would kill millions. But before that happened, the world itself had to survive the cold. The darkness refused to leave. Weeks became months, and months became years. People waited for the sun to return, but it never did. Temperatures continued to fall. Summer no longer felt like summer. Winters became longer, and harvests became smaller. Food became precious. Villages began to empty. Entire families abandoned their homes. Across Europe, people started fighting over what little remained. But this wasn't happening in one kingdom. It was happening everywhere. From Ireland to China, ancient records describe strange skies, cold summers, and widespread famine. Trees stopped producing fruit. Fields produced almost nothing. And hunger became impossible to escape. Trade routes collapsed. Prices soared, and entire regions fell into chaos. Some believed they had angered the gods. Others feared the end of the world. But nobody knew the truth, because high above them, something had happened that no human could see, and the effects would last for years. But the cold and the hunger were only the beginning, because 5 years later, something even worse arrived. Something that would kill millions and leave entire cities empty. But somehow, things became even worse, because the darkness lasted for years and weakened entire civilizations. People were already starving, kingdoms were already struggling, and communities were already desperate. Then, 5 years later, a new disaster appeared, not in the sky, not in the fields, but among the people themselves. A deadly disease began to spread. At first, nobody understood what it was. People developed fevers. Others became weak. Entire families disappeared. Cities began to empty. Trade routes became silent. And fear returned once again. Historians would later call it the Justinian Plague, and it would kill millions. But perhaps the most terrifying part was that humanity still had no idea what had caused any of this. To the people living through it, it felt like the world itself had turned against them. And for a moment, it seemed possible that civilization might never recover. For centuries, nobody knew what had happened. Ancient writers described strange skies, cold summers, failed harvests, and years of suffering. But they had no explanation. The mystery survived for nearly 1,500 years. Then modern scientists began to investigate, and what they discovered was astonishing. Evidence hidden inside ancient trees showed that something dramatic had happened. Ice cores collected from Greenland contained strange particles, volcanic ash, not from one eruption, but from several. Massive eruptions had filled the atmosphere with dust. Sunlight was blocked. Temperatures fell. And the climate changed across the world. What ancient people had witnessed was not a punishment from the gods. It was nature itself, and humanity was completely powerless against it. Civilizations weakened, millions suffered, and the world entered one of the darkest periods in human history. But perhaps the most remarkable part is that humanity survived. Empires fell, kingdoms changed, and entire generations disappeared. But civilization endured, and eventually, the sun returned. Today, scientists believe they have finally solved the mystery. But the people who lived through it never knew the truth. They only knew what they could see. Dark skies, empty fields, and years without answers. Imagine waking up every morning beneath a sun that no longer looked normal. Imagine watching your crops fail, watching food disappear, watching your world slowly change. There were no scientists, no satellites, no weather forecasts, only rumors and fear. Nobody knew when it would end. Nobody knew why it had begun. And nobody knew if tomorrow would be any better. Yet somehow, humanity endured. Civilizations adapted, kingdoms changed, and life continued. But perhaps that is what makes the year 536 so terrifying. Not because people suffered, but because they suffered without understanding why. And history leaves us with an uncomfortable question. What if something similar happened today? What if the skies suddenly darkened? What if harvests failed around the world? What if modern civilization faced the same uncertainty? Would we survive? Or have we simply forgotten how fragile our world really is? Because 1500 years ago, humanity entered one of its darkest chapters, and for a moment, it almost lost everything.